I was standing by the kitchen counter, reaching up into the cabinet for the set of ceramic mugs we only used when someone stayed over, the kind with the chipped blue rims that still somehow matched the chipped blue tiles in our kitchen. And for a second, I just focused on the mundane weight of the ceramic in my fingers because it felt easier than acknowledging the echo of laughter coming from the living room, sharp and sudden, and full of something I couldn't quite name but felt anyway. Like a gust of warm wind through a window you didn't know was open. I paused with my hand on the mug, not moving, listening as Ellie's giggle lifted through the hallway like a melody I used to know by heart. And right under it was his voice, low and rich and smooth in the way young men's voices sometimes are when they're trying to impress without sounding like they're trying. And I found myself walking without thinking, carrying the mugs like some kind of excuse to be in the doorway where I could see without being seen. They were on the couch, sunk into the cushions like they'd melted into each other, and Jason's arm was looped casually but firmly around Ellie's waist, holding her the way you hold something you think belongs to you completely. But what made my breath catch, what made something shift under my ribs, was that his eyes weren't on her. Not when she was laughing, not when she leaned her head back on his shoulder, not even when she nudged him playfully with her elbow. No, his gaze was over her shoulder and locked directly onto mine, like he'd known I was standing there the entire time and had been waiting for the exact second our eyes would meet. He didn't look away when I froze, didn't flinch or pretend not to see me. He just held my gaze, steady and unreadable, and in that half second something passed between us that didn't have a name but had weight. Ellie turned at the sound of my footstep and gave me her bright, innocent smile, the one she's had since she was a little girl sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor eating cereal out of the box, and said, "Morning, Mom," while Jason nodded with that quiet confidence he always carried and added, "Good morning, Mrs. Harper." But the moment his voice hit my name, something inside me reacted before my brain did, and I said, "Sarah," too quickly, too sharply, and maybe just a little too quietly, but still loud enough to hear the edge in it. Because for the first time since they started dating, I didn't want to be the mother-in-law in the room. The next day, Ellie showed up in my kitchen in one of her oversized cardigans with a paper coffee cup and an idea she couldn't wait to spill. Her words tumbling over each other like they always did when she got excited about something she hadn't thought all the way through yet. And she said she wanted to open a small cafe, something just for herself, not flashy, not big, just personal. And then she looked at me like she always does when she needs me, and asked if I could help with the supplier side of things because I always had a way with people, and she didn't know where to begin with all the ordering and logistics. I nodded because that's what mothers do. They nod when their daughters ask for help, and because there was something in her voice that made me want to believe this project was going to bring us closer instead of pulling something apart. Jason volunteered to handle the physical work, said he needed a distraction from his job hunt and liked using his hands. And when I walked into the empty space they'd rented, he was already halfway through painting the far wall, sleeves rolled up, shirt clinging to his back with streaks of white and gray dusted across his chest like he'd been dipped in construction. And I remember pausing for just a moment too long at the door because the sight of him, arms taut with effort, back flexing as he reached upward, wasn't something I expected to react to, but I did. He asked me to hold the ladder while he installed a shelf, said it like it was nothing, just a task to cross off the list. And I stood at the base of the steps, gripping the metal frame with both hands while he climbed, and when he reached for balance, his hand slid down onto my shoulder. Not a firm press, not a grab, just a slow drag of skin against fabric that lingered long enough for both of us to notice and neither of us to mention. It could have been nothing, but it wasn't. Later, we sat down for lunch at the folding table Ellie had brought in from home. 3 sandwiches in paper wrappers, 3 bottles of lemonade sweating onto napkins, and while Ellie told some story about a client who'd sent her the wrong logo files and ended up using a picture of a llama instead of a latte on the sample mugs, Jason laughed with that easy warmth that made you want to laugh too. But I felt the shift in the air when he looked at me again, not at the joke, not at the food, at me with a gaze too direct and too quiet to be innocent, and I felt the heat crawl up my neck because I knew what he was doing, even if Ellie didn't. The next morning, I watched her buzz around the kitchen packing samples and color swatches like nothing had happened, like she hadn't noticed the way his eyes shifted across the table or the way my hand had paused on his arm just a moment too long when I passed him a napkin. And I realized with a strange kind of dread that she hadn't seen any of it because she trusted us both, and worse, because part of me didn't want to stop it. I told myself I was imagining things, but my body already knew better. I caught myself, brushing my hair a little smoother before going to the site, choosing earrings I hadn't worn in years, checking my reflection twice in the car window before stepping out. It wasn't a decision. It was a reaction. And then came the note, tucked beneath the flap of my glove box like a secret I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. A small folded piece of paper with one line written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "You know how to look at someone, like nobody else. That's dangerous. I read it twice, then again. My fingers curled around it before my thoughts could catch up with the implications. And right then, like a punchline I didn't expect, Ellie knocked on the driver's side window and grinned through the glass. "Mom," she said. "You looked a million miles away." I smiled. I lied. I said, "Just thinking." I folded the note slowly and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, careful not to meet Ellie's eyes while she stood there smiling like she always did when waiting for an answer she already believed would be simple. But there was nothing simple about the weight of that one sentence now burning against my chest like it had a pulse of its own, and while I nodded and said something vague about being tired, I felt something stirring just below the surface of my ribs, something I hadn't felt in years, not since before Ellie was even born. And it wasn't love or lust or longing exactly. It was just heat, slow, undeniable heat. We drove back to the cafe and she kept talking about fonts and sign styles and how she imagined the logo would look etched in glass, her voice bouncing around the car like sunlight on water, and I sat beside her answering with occasional hums and yeses, though in truth I wasn't really listening, because all I could hear was the echo of those words. You know how to look at someone like nobody else. That's dangerous. And I needed to understand when exactly he stopped seeing me as his girlfriend's mother and started seeing me as whatever this was. When we got there, Jason was already inside, hauling boxes of tools like he'd been waiting for something to do since dawn. And when he looked up and saw us walk through the door, his eyes flicked over me for barely a second, before turning back to his work like nothing had happened, like no note had been left, no gaze had lingered, no touch had happened beneath the ladder yesterday, and I couldn't decide if I was relieved or disappointed that he didn't say a word. Ellie handed him coffee and called him their head of renovation, laughing like this was some summer camp project that would last a month and then fade, and he smiled back at her, but it was quick, polite, not the kind of smile you remember. His shirt was splattered with paint, sleeves rolled high, and when he leaned over to measure part of the window frame, his back muscles moved under the fabric in a way that made me pause in the doorway and hold my breath without even realizing. I'd done it because somehow the way he moved felt like it was meant to be seen by someone else entirely. Later that day, he asked me if I could hold the ladder again while he installed one of the higher shelves, and I did, gripping the cool metal while he climbed up, both of us too aware of how close we were, and when he reached out to balance himself, his hand slid down onto my shoulder. Not a quick pat, not an accident, a slow, steady contact that didn't rush to end and didn't pretend to mean less than it did. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But we both felt it. The stillness that bloomed between us. The way the world seemed to shrink to just the weight of his palm and the place it touched. If someone had walked in, I think we still wouldn't have moved. We had lunch after that. The three of us around a fold-out table with paper sandwiches and store-brand lemonade in sweating plastic bottles. And Ellie told some story about a college professor who once sent an email to her dog instead of to his class and only realized it when he got a bounce back from Biscuit. And Jason laughed, that warm kind of laugh that makes everyone else laugh too, but even then, even in that moment of lightness, I felt his gaze shift, slide across to me, not rude or lingering, just direct, too direct. And I couldn't help but glance away like I'd touched something too hot and wasn't supposed to. The next morning, Ellie was still caught up in a whirlwind of fabric swatches and color palettes, humming while she poured cereal, and I watched, her with this growing ache in my chest because she didn't see it. Not the way he looked at me, not the way my hand hesitated an inch too long on his when I passed him the sugar, not the way my voice softened when I asked him questions, and, worst of all, not the way I had started to dress again like someone might be noticing. She trusted both of us, completely. And maybe that's what made the whole thing so dangerous. Not the looks or the touches or the silences, but the fact that nothing had been said, and yet something real was already unfolding beneath it all. Told myself I was imagining it, that this was just one of those phases of confusion that comes after 40 when everything feels too quiet for too long. But my body had its own memory, and it remembered the way his eyes didn't flinch, the way his hand didn't move, the way the note felt in my palm like a promise no one had dared speak out loud. And then came the second note, this time tucked not under the visor, but slipped between the emergency brake and the center console, so close to my fingertips I almost didn't notice until I brushed against it with the edge of my sleeve. It was folded with the same precision, written in the same clear, deliberate handwriting, and it simply read, "You know how to look at someone like nobody else. That's dangerous." I stared at it for what felt like minutes, the world outside my windshield blurred by the rising heat, by the weight of what it meant, and I didn't know whether to feel terrified or thrilled or ashamed or flattered, only that I felt awake in a way I hadn't in years. My fingers curled around the paper, and for a moment it was the only real thing in the world. Not the cafe, not Ellie's voice, not my own breath fogging up the glass. And right then, like something from a movie or maybe a nightmare. Ellie knocked on the driver's side window, her face cheerful and open, and heartbreakingly unaware as she leaned closer and smiled. "Mom," she said through the glass, "you looked a million miles away." I swallowed the moment. I smiled back. I said, "Just thinking," but I didn't tell her what I was thinking about. I didn't tell her I was thinking about her boyfriend. The cafe was finally starting to take shape, not just physically with shelves and lighting and new tiles being laid down over the cracked linoleum, but with a rhythm that made it feel like something real instead of one of Ellie's passing ideas that usually burned bright and fast before vanishing completely. And though we were still surrounded by paint cans and flattened cardboard boxes and a layer of dust that settled over everything like winter frost, I could already imagine people sitting at the window with coffee and conversation while the morning light curved across the counter. I had come in early to help organize the invoices when Jason approached from the back room, holding a clipboard in one hand and wiping his other against his jeans. And with a calm that didn't match the tension I felt rising every time we stood too close, he asked if I'd help pick out furniture because, in his words, I had a better sense of comfort and space than either of them ever would. And when I glanced over at Ellie, who was leaning over her tablet sketching layout options, she looked up and said she was glad I'd take that part on because she didn't know the first thing about couches or chairs or what made a space feel like home. I said yes, of course, because saying no would have drawn more attention than agreeing, and because a part of me, the part I didn't like to admit was growing louder, wanted to spend more time with him in places that weren't always defined by Ellie's presence, and that same part had already memorized the way his shirts clung to his shoulders when he stretched and how he smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee grounds when he leaned in to show me plans. The next morning, we left together in his truck, just the two of us, heading toward a warehouse on the edge of town that carried reclaimed wood furniture and vintage pieces Ellie had circled in catalogs, and I told myself it was just a simple errand, nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, just two adults working on a shared project. The ride started quiet, the way most early drives do, but then the radio kicked in with some old Fleetwood Mac song, and Jason started humming along without realizing, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel in time with the music, and I noticed, not for the first time, how his hand trembled slightly every time we slowed for a light or turned down a side street. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure I was supposed to notice, and maybe he didn't know it showed. But I kept watching from the corner of my eye until the song faded into another, and he reached across the seat to grab a swatch book, flipping to a page of textures and sliding it between us. Holding my hand gently to run my fingers across a fabric he said felt lived in, but expensive, and his skin was warm, steady now. And when I tried to pull away after a beat or two, his hand didn't let go right away. He said, "You make everything feel calm. I'm always calmer around you." And then looked back to the road like nothing had been said at all, like that kind of truth was just something people said on the way to pick out furniture for a cafe neither of them would ever fully own. We stopped at a roadside diner that had probably looked the same since 1972, all chrome edges and cracked booths and a menu that hadn't changed in decades. And we ate grilled cheese and fries under yellowed lights while Jason stirred his coffee slowly, and then, without warning or any sort of buildup, looked straight at me and asked, "What if I wasn't with her? What if I met you first?" And the way he said it wasn't hypothetical or wistful or romantic. It was clear and still and heavy like a rock dropped into water with no ripples. And I sat back because I needed air suddenly, even though the booth felt cold, and the window beside us was sealed tight. I answered too fast because I had to, because I couldn't let the silence drag long enough for him to believe I might be thinking about it. And I said, "I'm the mother of your girlfriend," sharp and clipped and harder than I'd meant it to sound, but he didn't flinch or apologize or look away. He just smiled, slow and quiet like he'd heard the words, but not the meaning, and said, "Is that really all you want to say?" Which wasn't fair and wasn't gentle, and yet it landed like an invitation anyway. That night, hours later, when the sun had dipped and Ellie was at home nursing a headache from too many emails and too little food, I returned to the cafe with a paper cup of her favorite cinnamon blend and another for Jason, because she'd forgotten it earlier and I'd told myself it was just a small thing, a kind gesture, a reason to stop by without making it seem like anything more. He was alone in the back, sitting at the counter with his sleeves rolled and a pen in hand, scribbling a list of things that still needed doing, and he looked up when I came in and nodded toward the mug before saying, "You know, I've always imagined being with someone like you, someone who already knows who they are. That's rare." I didn't answer because my throat felt tight, and when he stood and stepped forward to take the cup from my hand, he didn't back away immediately. He stayed close, holding the mug but not looking at it, eyes locked to mine like there was something he wasn't sure he could say until he saw how I'd react. And then, barely above a whisper, he asked, "Do you want me to kiss you?" Not like a tease, not like a joke, but like a man asking something he already knew the answer to. I stepped back because I had to, because the room was too quiet and his breath was too warm, and the moment was seconds from becoming something that would shatter everything, and I said, "If you ever tell Ellie anything, if you so much as hint, I will disappear from both of your lives forever." And my voice didn't shake even though everything inside me did, and he looked at me for a long time, then smiled that same quiet way again and said, "So you want to stay?" And as I turned and walked toward the back hallway, heart pounding like I'd just sprinted through rain, I saw it. A black dome in the corner of the ceiling, faintly dusty, almost invisible unless you were looking, and my blood froze because it looked exactly like a security camera, the kind that records everything even when no one's watching. But when I stepped closer, I saw the tiny sticker on the side, faded and peeling, reading for display only, not functional. And I exhaled. In a sharp burst of relief I hadn't known I was holding. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, pretending to check my phone, pretending to adjust my jacket, pretending to be someone who wasn't shaken by the idea that a single black dome in the corner could have turned everything upside down in one blink. But the truth was, I needed that moment to gather what was left of my self-control and press it back into my spine like armor, because walking back into that room meant facing him again, and I wasn't sure what would happen if he so much as said my name the wrong way. When I returned, he was still at the counter, leaning on one elbow, fingers tapping the rim of the mug in slow, distracted beats, his gaze cast down toward the paper in front of him but clearly not reading a word of it. And when he heard my footsteps, he looked up with a calm that felt practiced, too even to be real, like he knew exactly what I had seen and exactly what I had feared. I didn't say anything because what could I possibly say to a man who just asked if I wanted to be kissed while my daughter was at home thinking we were building her dream together? And more than that, what could I say to myself now that I knew I hadn't walked away because I didn't want it? I had walked away because I did. I told him I needed to leave, that Ellie was waiting on a sample board we'd left in the backseat of the car, and he didn't argue, didn't try to stop me, just nodded and picked up his pen again as if the moment had been folded neatly and placed back into a drawer where we'd both pretend it had never existed. But it didn't go away. It followed me through the door, sat beside me on the ride home, hummed quietly in the kitchen while Ellie asked how the list was coming along, and even though I answered her questions and nodded at the right times and helped sort through color, palettes, every part of me felt like it had been touched in a way that couldn't be undone. The next morning, I avoided the cafe, told Ellie I had errands, told myself I needed air, but the truth was, I couldn't be in that space with him without wondering if every wall had seen what we hadn't done but almost did. I drove for an hour without a plan, through neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, past the school where I used to wait for Ellie in the pickup line, past the grocery store where I first let her walk alone down an aisle, remembering who I was before all this, trying to find the version of me who could still draw lines and keep them. That afternoon, I came back to help Ellie measure the front window for decals, and she was so full of energy, so sure of our progress that I had to look away when she said, "I think Jason's been amazing through all this, don't you think, Mom?" Because the way she said his name, so naturally, so innocently, made it feel like poison in my ears, and I hated myself for being the reason it didn't sound pure anymore. I nodded and said something safe, something bland, something forgettable, but I could feel her watching me, not because she suspected anything, but because she trusted me, and that trust made everything feel heavier than guilt. Later that night, I returned alone, telling myself it was just to drop off a box of table runners we'd ordered online, but as I unlocked the door and stepped into the silence, I already knew he'd be there. Jason was sitting in the same chair as before, now with his hoodie pulled up, eyes tired in the kind of way that came from thinking too much. And when he looked up at me, it wasn't with the intensity of before, but with something softer. Something that made me feel like he wasn't trying to win or tempt or convince, but simply understand what we were doing and whether it could be stopped. I set the box on the counter without a word and started to leave, but he spoke low and steady, saying he knew I hated him for what he asked the night before, but that he hadn't asked it to corner me or hurt her or make things messy. He asked it because he hadn't stopped thinking about me since the day I first stepped into the kitchen in that blue sweater with a spoon in my hand and a look on my face like I already knew what kind of man he was. I told him that was the problem. I did know what kind of man he was, and I also knew what kind of woman I had always tried to be, and the space between those two truths was the only place we could safely exist. He didn't smile this time. He just said he understood, that if I walked away now and never came back alone again, he wouldn't press it, wouldn't ask again, wouldn't even leave another note, and for a second, I believed him. But then he said one last thing, not with urgency or hope, just with that same stillness he always carried when he wanted me to hear something for real. If I had met you first, none of this would have been complicated. I left before I could answer, before my body did something my mind couldn't take back, and as I walked through the back hallway again, My eyes involuntarily flicked toward the fake camera in the ceiling, still dusty, still lifeless, and I whispered, half to it and half to myself, not yet. As if I was speaking to the future, to the moment that hadn't happened but kept waiting anyway, and as I pushed open the back door into the cold night air, I knew one thing for sure. We hadn't been caught yet, but we were already deep inside something that wouldn't stay hidden for long. The morning started in that odd silence only early hours in unfinished places can hold, where even the sound of footsteps seemed too sharp against the concrete floor. And as I unlocked the door to the cafe with my key already halfway turned from muscle memory, I felt that peculiar hush wrap around me like something waiting, not warm exactly, but not cold either. And I knew without needing to ask that Ellie had already left for her design presentation downtown because the kitchen was spotless and her travel mug was missing from the counter, which meant it was just him and me again, under the same half-installed lighting and the familiar tension that had settled between us like invisible dust on every new surface. I didn't want to look for him right away, didn't want to feel that flicker in my chest start up again too early, so I walked slowly through the side hallway, pretending to check on storage boxes that hadn't moved in a week, letting my fingers trail along the edge of the wooden trim just to keep them busy. But I heard him before I saw him, the low muttering, the shuffle of work boots against tile, the unmistakable sound of a man half focused on a task and half distracted by something else entirely. He was crouched beneath the wall outlet near the espresso bar, tools splayed out on a towel beside him, one wire between his fingers and another hanging from his mouth as he tried to thread them together, and when he noticed me watching from the doorway, he gave a crooked smile and asked if I could hand him the red spool from the shelf behind me, which I did, letting my hand linger just long enough for my thumb to brush against his knuckle, like I didn't mean to, but absolutely did. He didn't flinch, just said thanks, and nodded toward the half-installed breaker panel, explaining something about grounding and resistance, which I barely heard because I was already walking toward the ladder and asking if he needed me to hold it again while he worked on the overhead wiring. He climbed slowly, one hand gripping the top rail while the other reached into his back pocket for the pliers, and when he told me to steady it from the base, I did, pressing my palms against the cold aluminum and bracing it with my shoulder like I had yesterday. And when he asked if I could pass him the next set of leads, I reached up without thinking, stretching just far enough that my wrist bumped into his knee and then slid slightly across his thigh as I tried to find a balance I didn't actually need to lose. His breath caught, I heard it, and then he froze for just a moment too long, glancing down at me with that same question in his eyes I'd seen behind every word he hadn't said for the past 2 weeks. "You didn't pull away yesterday," he said, low and even, like it wasn't a challenge or a memory, but a statement of fact he expected me to either confirm or deny, and I kept my eyes on the rung of the ladder near his boot as I answered, "That was a conversation," because it was the only response that didn't sound like an admission. But then he leaned just slightly closer, still balancing above me but no longer working, and said, "And this? This is just a conversation too?" There was no pause, no hesitation, just the weight of his gaze and the shift of his body as he came down 2 steps until he was almost at my height, not touching me yet but close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off his skin in the narrow space between us. And then his hand moved to the side of my face, slow, tentative, like he was still waiting for me to tell him no, and he kissed me, not hard or fast or desperate, but like a question asked in a language we both already understood. I froze, not out of fear but out of disbelief, not because I didn't want it, but because I had wanted it for too long, and didn't know what it meant to finally have it, and my lips moved in answer before my mind could catch up, soft at first, unsure, then firmer, more certain, until he pulled back and we both stood there not saying anything, just breathing, just waiting to see who would speak first. He didn't look away, didn't step back, just said, "If I did that again, would you let me?" And the question wasn't teasing or sweet, it was real and raw and heavy with something I didn't want to name. I looked at him, not his mouth, not his hands, but his eyes, and whispered, "Don't you dare." And then I kissed him before he could move or answer or doubt, and this time it wasn't slow or gentle or quiet. It was fast and real and full of every single moment we hadn't dared to touch until now. And I could feel him respond instantly, hands at my waist, breath uneven, like he'd been holding it since the moment we met. We only stopped because we heard the door, not footsteps, not voices, just the creak of the back entrance swinging, slightly in the breeze, and we froze, pulling apart like teenagers caught doing something they knew they shouldn't. But when we peeked around the corner, there was no one, just the wind pushing against the not quite latched frame. And the ridiculous relief made us both start laughing, too loud, too fast, the kind of laugh that's more nerves than joy, and I leaned against the counter to catch my breath while he leaned against the wall like he needed it too. I glanced down at his hands, still open like they were expecting to hold me again, and said, You hold me like I'm something that already belongs to you. And his answer came back without a pause, steady and quiet and not the least bit unsure. Aren't you? His words didn't ask for confirmation. They just hovered between us like something that had always been true, but only now spoken out loud. And I didn't answer because I didn't know how to answer a question like that without breaking apart everything I had spent years holding together. So instead, I turned away and started organizing a pile of unused light fixtures near the register, pretending that my hands were too full and my mind too occupied to process what had just happened, even though every part of my body was still, humming from the weight of his kiss, and the way his fingers had curled just slightly into my sides like he didn't want to let go. He didn't push for more, didn't come closer again, just stood where he was watching me in silence that felt softer than space and louder than shouting, and for a few seconds I wished he would say something stupid or awkward or wrong just to make it easier to pull back into the version of myself I knew how to live with. Instead, I picked up a marker from the counter and scribbled a note to myself on a shipping box that didn't need labeling, writing words I'd forget on purpose just to fill the space, because pretending is easier when you have props, and I could feel his eyes follow my movements like he was memorizing the way I pulled away from him without really leaving the room, like he understood that distance didn't always happen in steps. I asked him if he'd checked the delivery logs, my voice too high and too fast, and he nodded like he knew it wasn't about inventory at all, but gave me the answer anyway. And just like that, we dropped back into the routine, the protective shell of tasks and updates and renovations, as if we could pretend we hadn't cracked something open and watched it pour out in the middle of a weekday morning with the paint still drying on the walls. We worked like that for another hour, him on the wiring above the sink, me rearranging a display shelf that hadn't been touched in days, and we didn't speak about it, didn't circle back, but the air between us was thicker now, denser, with the weight of what we'd done, and the knowledge that we would do it again. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered how much time we had left before the weight of it reached Ellie. Because love doesn't need to be confessed to be discovered, especially not by someone who knows how you breathe when you're hiding something. I looked up just once, caught his eyes across the cafe, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. That same electric fear tangled in the quiet thrill of finally touching what you've been told not to want. My phone buzzed on the counter and I jumped, more from guilt than surprise, because I wasn't ready to be pulled out of the moment and thrown back into the real world where people still trusted me and believed I was safe and good and constant. But I picked it up anyway because ignoring it would have made the silence unbearable. The message lit up the screen with Ellie's name, and for a split second I expected something different. A question, a check-in, something harmless. But it read, "I'm staying an extra couple of days." The client asked me to help refine the pitch. "Jason's with you, right? Don't lose him on me." I stared at those words like they'd been cut from a sharper blade than I was ready for, and my hands tightened around the phone instinctively because I didn't know if I was holding something dangerous or if it was holding me. The smiley face at the end, playful, trusting, light, hit harder than any accusation would have because there was no suspicion in her words, no hint that she knew what was happening under her nose, and that made it worse. I felt him step closer before he said anything, close enough to glance at the screen without needing to ask what it said, and when he did, I heard his breath hitch for the briefest second before he spoke. "She trusts you," he said. And it wasn't judgment or sarcasm or even warning. It was just fact, said with the quiet devastation of someone who knows what comes next, whether you say it or not. I nodded because what else could I do? And I set the phone down slowly, like it had just burned me, and I walked toward the back hallway without another word, not fast, not dramatic, just moving the only direction I could without falling apart. Behind me, he didn't call out, didn't follow, just stayed rooted in place like someone who knew that chasing wouldn't make me stay. And as I turned the corner and pressed my palm flat to the wall for balance, I didn't cry, I didn't breathe. I just stood there listening to the silence grow loud again. It was then, in the stillness, that I looked up toward the window and saw our reflections in the stainless steel of the coffee machine across the room, distorted by the curve of the surface, but still unmistakably us. My posture rigid, his leaning forward with one hand on the counter, both of us looking like something out of balance and too close to falling. I thought about taking a picture of it, about capturing the exact moment everything tipped, but instead I reached up and pressed my fingers against the glass like that would erase it, like I could smudge the truth out of its own frame. I walked back slowly, picked up a rag from the counter, and started wiping the same clean spot I'd already wiped that morning. Because when you can't undo a kiss, sometimes all you can do is polish the surface until it stops looking like proof. He didn't speak again, and neither did I, because there was nothing left to say. We'd already said it all with our mouths and our hands and the silence that followed. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. It was only the moment before the fall. I arrived at the cafe earlier than usual that morning, The street still half asleep, the air outside sharp with that in-between chill of a day that hadn't yet decided if it would warm up or stay gray, and I hadn't planned it that way. I'd woken up restless, too aware of the silence in my bedroom, too aware of the ache behind my eyes, too aware of the way my fingers kept brushing the inside of my palm like they were still reaching for something that wasn't there. I told myself I'd come in to check inventory, to beat the delivery truck, to get a jump on the day before Jason arrived. But when I stepped inside and saw him stretched out across the sofa near the back wall, fast asleep with his arm hanging off the side and his t-shirt bunched halfway up his stomach, revealing a line of skin I had no right to stare at, I knew I hadn't come for the cafe. He looked peaceful in a way he never did when he was awake, like whatever weight he carried during the day had finally slipped off his chest long enough for his breath to even out. And I stood there longer than I should have, not moving, not even blinking, just letting my eyes trace the shape of him in this rare stillness, memorizing the lines of his body not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. When he stirred, his hand moved first, dragging along the arm of the couch before curling into a fist, and then flattening again like he was reaching for something in his sleep. And when his eyes opened and found mine across the room, there was no confusion or panic, just a slow smile like he'd been expecting me all along. "Come here," he said, voice rough from sleep and deeper than usual, and I took a few steps before I even thought about it, because the way he said it wasn't a command or a suggestion. It was a memory we hadn't made yet but already shared. I sat on the floor beside the couch, pulling my knees up to my chest like I hadn't done since I was 19, and he reached down to brush my hair back with fingers that moved too carefully for someone just waking up. "You're in my dreams," he said, not dramatically, not even like he was trying to be romantic, just plainly, as if it was a fact he'd grown used to. "And in them, you're not wearing a ring, and Ellie is just a name someone says in passing." I didn't answer because there was no answer that wouldn't either ruin the moment or prove him right. So I reached into my bag and pulled out the container of cut fruit I'd grabbed from my fridge in a daze before leaving the house, and we sat there on the cold tile floor, eating it together like two kids who had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. He joked that strawberries always reminded him of his grandmother's porch, and I laughed more than I should have when he tried to feed me a piece off the tip of his pocket knife, and when he looked at my mouth and said, "You have lips meant for something other than small talk?" I tried to play it off with a laugh and said, "They're for conversation, nothing more." But the way his eyes lingered told me he didn't believe that for a second, and maybe I didn't either. I reached for another grape just to have something to do with my hands, and just as I leaned in, the front door slammed open without warning, crashing against the wall with the jarring force of someone not expecting to find anything worth hiding. And in walked the delivery guy, young and sharp-eyed with a clipboard in hand and a smirk that said he'd seen plenty of things he wasn't paid enough to comment on. I bolted to my feet so fast I knocked over the fruit container, pieces scattering across the floor like a confession. We didn't plan to make, and Jason, to his credit, pulled the blanket up to his chest and sat up straight in one smooth motion, like he could still pass for someone who'd just nodded off mid-shift. The guy looked from me to Jason and back again, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something clever, but he didn't. Just handed over the delivery invoice without meeting my eyes and said, "Need a signature," like it meant something more than it did. I signed too quickly, too sloppily, my hand shaking in a way I hoped looked like nerves from being startled and not shame. And when he left, the silence he left behind was louder than the door slam had been. I bent down to pick up the grapes while Jason tossed the blanket onto the back of the couch and muttered something about how we needed to be more careful. But I couldn't hear him clearly over the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears because the air had changed. It felt tighter, more brittle, like something was about to break and we wouldn't be able to put it back together fast enough. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, not looking at him, not trusting what would happen if I did. "I feel it getting closer, like the real world is breathing down our necks." And he came up behind me so quietly I didn't realize he was there until I felt the warmth of his chest just an inch from my back and heard him say, "I don't feel that. I just feel you." His lips brushed the side of my neck so gently I might have imagined it, but I didn't flinch, didn't step away, didn't say no. And when my mouth formed the word yes, it wasn't loud or brave or reckless. It was soft and broken and real because it was the truth I hadn't dared say out loud until now. We stood like that for what felt like a full minute, not touching beyond breath and skin and something deeper neither of us could name. And when I finally moved, it wasn't away from him. It was into the moment, not out of it. That evening, just before closing, Ellie called while I was wiping down the front counter, and her voice was lighter than it had been in days. Like the trip was giving her something she needed, and she asked if I could send a photo of the current setup because her logo designer wanted to play with palette contrasts using the real space instead of mock-ups. I agreed because how could I not, and I took the photo quickly before I could overthink it. The lights above the bar glowing softly, the plants in the window catching the last of the sun, the entire place looking more complete than it felt. I hit send, and only after I did, as the image disappeared into the digital nowhere of the text thread, did I look again. And my heart dropped. Jason was in the photo, standing too close behind me in the reflection of the espresso machine, just enough to be undeniable. My phone buzzed a second later. Ellie, is he there with you? Wait, what is that reflection? I stared at the message, my hand still holding the phone like it might catch fire from the weight of the words, and for a moment I didn't move at all, didn't breathe, didn't think, because I could feel the shape of my heartbeat shifting in my throat as the image echoed back at me from the screen, not just the photograph I had taken seconds earlier, but the reflection embedded within it. The undeniable presence of Jason standing too close behind me, not touching, but too near. For it to mean nothing, his posture too familiar, too relaxed, as if that distance between us had long ago been broken and never repaired. I wanted to believe maybe she wouldn't notice, that she'd shrug it off or think it was a trick of the light or a smudge on the machine's polished chrome. But I knew my daughter, and I knew that tone in her message, the exact precision of her phrasing, that pause between one sentence and the next, that meant her brain was already 5 steps ahead of the question she was asking out loud. Jason stood across the room now, head down, fingers running through his hair like he could already feel the shift in the air, and he didn't say anything. Maybe because he hadn't heard the message, or maybe because he had, and he knew as well as I did what was coming next. I typed back quickly. Too quickly, my thumbs numb as I wrote something vague, something dismissive, something like, he was helping me move the shelf, didn't realize he was in the shot, and even as I hit send, I knew it wasn't enough. Not because the excuse was bad, but because the truth had a way of bleeding through even the most practiced lie, especially when the person you're lying to is someone who once shared your face. The response came fast. Don't worry, I'm taking the night flight, no need to explain, just make sure he's not there. That was it. No period, no punctuation, just cold certainty wrapped in carefully clipped words, and I stood there, in the middle of the cafe with the phone still glowing in my palm, realizing the inevitable had finally caught up with us, that all the pauses and half moments and near kisses and stolen hours had finally cast a shadow long enough for her to see, and now she wasn't asking anymore, she was coming. I looked up at Jason, and his eyes met mine like he already knew what I was going to say, but I said it anyway because silence was no longer a shield. And I told him she was coming home tonight and that we didn't have time to figure out what we were or weren't, because by morning everything would look different. He didn't argue or curse or panic, just nodded slowly and said, "Then I'll be gone before she walks through that door." And something in his voice cracked at the end of that sentence, not enough to break, but enough for me to hear how hard he was holding himself together. I wanted to say something then, something clear and right and honest, but all I could manage was a whisper that didn't sound like it belonged to me. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. And he laughed once, short and bitter, and said, "Nobody ever does." We started cleaning up the space like it mattered, like organizing cushions and wiping counters could erase what we'd done, and I folded the towel in my hands 4 times before setting it down, trying to buy myself time in between decisions I couldn't make. Jason packed up his tools without speaking. Every motion sharp and efficient like muscle memory was the only thing keeping him grounded. And I stood near the front, pretending to check the windows while really I was watching the street outside. Like I expected Ellie to appear right then and there, suitcase in one hand and heartbreak already written on her face. When he finally stepped toward the door, duffel slung over his shoulder, he turned one last time and looked at me the way he had that first day by the ladder, not pleading, not apologizing, just looking, and said, "If I were braver, I'd ask you to come with me." And I replied, without thinking, "If I were braver, I wouldn't let you walk out that door." And then he left, quietly, like he'd never been there at all. The cafe felt colder after that, more hollow, the kind of silence that doesn't invite peace, but fills your ears with everything you wish you hadn't said. And I sat at the table we had built together from reclaimed wood, tracing the knots and scratches with my fingernail, remembering the way he'd joked about them being like fingerprints, each one proof that something had happened here, even if no one ever saw it. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just waited, counting the hours until nightfall. Until the flight landed, until Ellie came home and everything that had been only between us would finally break out into the world where it could be seen and judged and hated. The last thing I did before turning off the lights was remove the note he'd once left in my car, the one that said, "You know how to look at someone like nobody else. That's dangerous." And I tucked it into the pocket of my coat without reading it again, because I didn't need the words to remember what they had started. I walked outside into the wind and stood there on the empty sidewalk as headlights passed in a blur, and I wondered if she was already in the air, staring at the night through a tiny window and trying to make sense of the image she couldn't unsee. She was coming, and I had no idea what I would tell her. The moment Ellie's message came through, I felt something inside me snap so quietly it didn't even make a sound, like the crack of thin ice just before it gives way. And as I stood there in the dim cafe with the glow of my phone still burning in my hand, I realized there was no time left to pretend, no words left to reshape the truth into something more palatable, and no space left between me and the consequence I had spent weeks pretending wasn't approaching. I turned toward Jason, who was still standing near the back wall, not moving, not asking, just waiting, and I walked to him fast with the kind of urgency that lives in the gut, not the heart, and told him in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else that he needed to leave before sunrise, that she was coming home and there would be no way to explain anything without destroying everything. And when I said the words, "This is over," he didn't flinch or ask for clarification. He just looked at me with an expression so unreadable it made my skin crawl. Instead of arguing or begging or trying to rewrite what we both already knew was written too deeply, he said only one thing, so calmly and so quietly I almost didn't hear it, but it landed harder than any accusation would have. "So it really started then?" And then he turned, picked up the jacket he had left slung over the back of the chair, and walked out through the side door without slamming it, without saying goodbye, without even looking back once. I didn't follow him. I didn't cry. I just stood there alone in the cafe with the silence pressing into my chest like a stone I couldn't lift, and I told myself it was for the best, that I had done the only thing I could to salvage whatever remained between my daughter and me. But the truth felt like ash on my tongue, dry and empty and impossible to swallow. When morning finally bled through the windows in streaks of gold and blue, I was still sitting at the same table where he had last stood, my coffee cold, my thoughts scattered, my breath shallow, and I wasn't ready for what came next, even though I had been rehearsing it in my mind all night. The door creaked open just after 8, and I knew it was her before I turned around. Not because I recognized the sound of her step, but because my body tensed in the exact way it always had when she was younger, and something fragile had broken that she didn't know how to forgive. Ellie stood in the doorway with her bag in one hand and her sunglasses still perched on top of her head, her smile tight and practiced and entirely without warmth, and she didn't say a word as she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me in a hug that didn't feel like comfort but like containment, as if she needed to be that close to read the truth in my heartbeat. "How's everything here?" she asked lightly, like we were discussing weekend chores or weather reports and not the fracture running beneath the floorboards. And I lied before I even thought it through, said, "Fine," with a steadiness I didn't feel, and watched her eyes move over my face like she already knew how much of that answer was performance. She started walking the cafe slowly, scanning each detail like she was cataloging evidence, her gaze sharper than I remembered, her silence louder than anything Jason and I had ever said out loud. And I stood frozen behind the counter, trying not to notice how her hand lingered on the chair he always sat in, or how she looked twice at the shelf we had installed together, or how her fingers brushed the windowsill as if checking for something invisible. She didn't speak again until she opened the storage cabinet in the back room, the one we never quite finished organizing, and pulled out a folded flannel shirt, with navy and white checks that had once belonged to Jason but somehow never left, and she held it up without asking, without accusing, without even blinking, then brought it to her nose and inhaled like someone trying to confirm what they already believed. "It smells like him," she said flatly, not angry yet, not crying, just narrating her own realization, and I swallowed hard before managing. He must have left it by accident, though the words felt brittle in my mouth, too dry to survive, the weight of what they were meant to cover. She looked at me then with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, one that trembled just enough to betray the war inside her chest, and said, "Accident?" Like she was repeating the word just to see if it would break apart between her teeth. And when she laughed, it wasn't cruel. It was sad, hollow and sharp at the edges. And her voice cracked slightly as she added, "You could have had anyone, Mom. Anyone. But you chose him." My knees almost gave out from the weight of it, and I stumbled forward with tears rising too fast to stop, words tumbling from my mouth before I could shape them into anything honest or defensible. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't. I swear I didn't plan," but she cut me off with a look that felt like a slap, not loud or violent but devastating in its precision, and said, "Exactly. You didn't think about me. You didn't think about how I'd feel watching the one person I let in look at you like I was never in the room." I opened my mouth again to respond, to explain, to take it back somehow, but the sound of the door opening behind us shattered the moment into silence as Jason stepped in, clearly unaware she had arrived, his keys still in his hand, his posture loose and casual until he saw her standing there holding his shirt like it was evidence in a trial neither of us could win. He stopped instantly, frozen mid-step like he could still reverse time if he stayed still enough, but Ellie didn't scream or cry or accuse. She just looked at him for a long, unblinking moment and asked, "So now you're with her? Or was this all just another version of you?" He didn't answer. He didn't answer because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound rehearsed or cowardly or too late. And in that moment, I realized with painful clarity that silence wasn't neutrality anymore. It was guilt-dressed. In restraint, it was confirmation by omission. It was every lingering glance and stolen touch and unspoken promise we thought we could keep between us, now stretched out under a light too bright to ignore. Ellie stood completely still, her hand still gripping the shirt like it was the only solid thing left in the room, and she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw it at him or tear it up or make a scene the way some part of me had imagined, the way I might have expected when I used to think pain always arrived loud and messy. She just stood there with her eyes fixed on him, and her voice impossibly steady as she asked again, quieter this time, but with the force of something final. "So is this who you are, or is this just who you are with her?" Still, he said nothing, and I could see in his face that he wasn't refusing to answer out of cruelty or shame, but because there were no words left that wouldn't make it worse. And somewhere beneath my own devastation, I respected that. The way he stood there and took the weight of her question without flinching. The way he didn't run or defend or try to soften the blow. Ellie didn't wait for an apology or an explanation or even a sign of remorse. She just looked from him to me and back again. And then something in her expression shifted. Not rage, not sorrow, just a kind of resignation that felt more brutal than either. And she nodded once to herself like a decision had been made long before she ever asked the question aloud. She walked past him without another word, not even brushing his shoulder, her movements graceful in a way that only comes when the pain is so deep it stops needing expression. And when she reached the door, she opened it carefully, stepped through slowly, and closed it behind her so gently it made me want to scream, because there was no dramatic exit, no slamming frame, no echo of chaos, just the quiet finality of something that had already died long before we admitted it. I didn't move. I didn't chase her. I didn't collapse to the floor even though every part of my body wanted to do something, anything, to make the weight of her absence feel less unbearable. Jason didn't move either. He stayed exactly where he was, just a few steps inside the doorway with his keys still in his hand, and his mouth set in a line so tight it looked like he'd bitten through whatever words he'd thought about offering. And when he finally looked at me, it wasn't with expectation or regret. It was with the raw kind of ache you only show someone who's already seen you at your most reckless. I wanted to speak, to fill the air with something that would keep the silence from closing in like a noose. But there was nothing left inside me that sounded like clarity, so I lowered my eyes and let the stillness speak for me, because in that moment, the only thing louder than the silence was the knowledge that everything had already unraveled. He took a slow step forward, not tentative but not assured either, and when he stopped in front of me, he didn't touch me, didn't ask for absolution, didn't try to kiss the grief out of me with some romantic lie we both would have believed 2 days ago. Instead, he leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath just under my jaw and whispered, "She hates you now no matter what happens." And there was no malice in his voice, just truth, plain and devastating and sharp as glass. I didn't lift my head. I didn't deny it. I just stood there with my hands open and useless at my sides as he added, "So at least stay with me." The words hit like water against a wall that had already cracked, not enough to break it further, but enough to remind me just how damaged it already was, and for a split second I wanted to give in, to let myself fall into the comfort of being wanted when being forgiven was no longer an option. But then I saw Ellie's face again. Not the face she made when she accused me, but the one from years ago, when she used to reach for my hand without thinking, when her trust was automatic and her love effortless, and I couldn't betray that memory by stepping closer to the man who had just stood in front of her with nothing to say. So I turned my face away from him and stepped back, not far, not fast, just enough to close the space he had tried to leave open between us, and he saw it for what it was. Not indecision, not hesitation, but refusal. He nodded once like he understood, like maybe he even expected it, and then he walked past me to the door without saying another word, the same way he had the night before. But this time it wasn't escape, it was surrender. When the door clicked, shut behind him, I finally let myself sit down, not in the chair we had shared, not at the table we had built, but on the floor near the back wall where I couldn't see the entrance, where I couldn't be seen, where I could pretend for just a few minutes that this hadn't happened at all. The silence around me didn't feel heavy now. It felt earned, like punishment wrapped in stillness, and I didn't fight it. I didn't move. I just stared at the space where she had stood, and the space where he had walked away, and the space inside me that now held both their absences like a wound I wasn't sure would ever close. And I knew then that nothing I said from this point forward would matter more than what I hadn't said soon enough. 3 months had passed since the morning Ellie closed the door without a sound, Since Jason walked out without asking me to follow, since the world I thought I had control over unraveled without ceremony, and left behind something polished and functioning but cold, and every morning since then I arrived at the cafe before anyone else, unlocked the doors in silence, turned on the lights one by one with practiced motion, checked the espresso machine without speaking, and arranged the tables with the same precision Ellie used to obsess over. And though the place was beautiful, styled exactly as we had planned with reclaimed wood counters and soft pendant lighting and hand-picked mugs in mismatched earth tones, I never drank my coffee inside anymore, not even once, not even on the mornings I arrived too early and had time to spare. Because something about sitting at those tables alone made the quiet feel louder than it should, and I wasn't ready to let the silence win like that. From the outside, the cafe looked like a success. The kind of small business people stopped in front of to take pictures of the window decals and post captions like charmingly local or hidden gem, and customers came steadily, drawn by the curated playlists and the perfectly poured lattes and the scent of cinnamon scones in the mornings, and I smiled when they complimented the decor, nodded when they said the energy felt authentic, and thanked them when they asked if it had always been my dream to own a place like this, even though the only dream I'd ever had was standing behind a different kind of counter, watching my daughter laugh with the person she thought she would build a life with, unaware of the storm waiting just outside the frame. Ellie never came back. Not for the summer launch, not for the press write-up in the neighborhood blog, not even when her father asked if we could try to organize a dinner, just the three of us. And when he called to ask where she had gone, I lied with the kind of practiced calm that comes from months of failing at the truth, telling him that she just needed time and space and maybe Seattle was exactly what she needed. A new city with clean sidewalks and better coffee, and no reason to look over her shoulder and remember the woman who betrayed her. And though he didn't press further, I could hear the disappointment in his silence, the kind that settles in between breaths and waits until it becomes resentment. Rick left quietly, without slamming doors or accusing me of anything dramatic. Without even raising his voice or demanding explanations, just came home one night, packed his things while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to read a takeout menu I had no intention of ordering from, and when I finally looked up, he was standing there with his coat in one hand and the spare keys in the other, and the look on his face wasn't angry or heartbroken, it was exhausted, and he said only one sentence before he closed the door behind him. "You loved the wrong person and forgot the one who was always standing right in front of you." He didn't wait for me to respond, and I didn't chase him, because deep down I knew he wasn't wrong. Jason didn't stay in town much longer after that, at least not anywhere I could see him, and he didn't leave with the same silence Rick did. He left a note, folded once, placed on the counter under the jar of brown sugar, and I found it late one night after closing, when I was sweeping crumbs and resetting chairs, and I read it 3 times before I stopped pretending it didn't sting. "I would have waited forever, but you chose shame instead of wanting me," it said. And the cruelest part was that I believed him, not because he deserved my belief, but because I knew he had waited longer than he should have, and I had turned away at the exact moment I should have stepped forward, and that was something I couldn't fix. Not with honesty, not with time, not with anything. The cafe kept moving even when I didn't, the way life does when it's detached from the people who gave it shape. And one afternoon, during a lull between the morning rush and the post-lunch lull, a young couple walked in, laughing too loudly and speaking too fast. And something about the angle of his jaw and the slope of his shoulders made my chest seize up before I even realized why. And when he leaned in to whisper something to the girl beside him, brushing her hair back as she laughed into her scarf, I froze, tray still in my hands, because for a split second I thought it was Jason. The way he smiled, the way he stood behind her like the world could wait, the way he didn't look at anyone else in the room. And it wasn't him, of course. But the echo was strong enough to break something loose in me I thought I had buried. I walked to the restroom without speaking, nodded to one of the girls at the register to cover for me, and locked the door behind me before the tears started, because there was no space in the front of the cafe for that kind of unraveling, and I stood there staring into the mirror above the sink for a long time, not recognizing the woman in front of me, not because of the wrinkles or the tired eyes or the mess of hair I hadn't bothered to fix, but because I could finally admit to myself the one truth I had avoided for months. I was the woman no one chose. Not Rick, not Jason, not even Ellie in the end. And there was no part of me left that could blame them, because I had built this wreck with my own hands, plank by plank, decision by decision, silence by silence. As I reached for the paper towels, my fingers brushed the edge of the small wooden tea shelf beside the sink, the one Jason had built with screws that didn't quite match and joints that always creaked when touched, and something sharp caught against my knuckle. A folded piece of paper wedged behind a jar of loose chamomile, yellowed now and curled at the edges. And I didn't need to open it to know what it said, because I had read it so many times I could still feel the words under my skin. "You know how to look at someone like nobody else. That's dangerous." I didn't need to read the note again, not because I remembered every word in perfect detail, but because the version of me who had once unfolded it with trembling fingers no longer existed in the same way, and standing in that narrow bathroom lit by soft overhead bulbs and washed in the scent of old tea and lemon soap, I realized that everything that had once made me feel alive now only reminded me how carefully I had burned the bridges I used to cross with pride. I ran my fingertips across the edge of the paper like touching it could take me back to the moment he'd written it, before anything had happened, before the lines had blurred, before desire became regret and silence became guilt, and I felt something shift inside me, not like healing or breaking, but like surrendering to the truth I had spent too long denying. I had wanted it, all of it, and now I was paying for it in the only currency that mattered: loss. I slipped the note into my pocket, not because I intended to keep it, but because throwing it away right then felt too theatrical, too final. And the truth was, I didn't want finality. I wanted understanding. I wanted softness. I wanted forgiveness that wasn't owed to me, and I knew how selfish that was, how impossible, how unforgivable. I splashed cold water on my face, letting it run down my cheeks until my breathing slowed and my eyes stopped stinging. And when I looked in the mirror again, I saw someone who no longer needed to pretend, not to her staff, not to her customers, not even to the empty walls she went home to each night. I stepped out of the bathroom with my shoulders a little lower and my chest a little looser, and I told myself that moving forward didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. It meant living with it in full view. The rest of the day passed, in a kind of quiet blur, the way time does when you stop expecting it to deliver anything meaningful, and I moved from counter to register to table with a calm I hadn't earned but accepted anyway, and as the sun began to dip behind the buildings, across the street, casting golden rectangles across the floor and catching the dust in ways that made the air itself look like it was remembering, I moved to the front window like I always did around this hour, out of habit more than need, pressing my fingertips to the edge of the glass and looking out at the people drifting by with umbrellas and grocery bags and tired expressions. Rain had started to fall, not heavy but steady, the kind that soaks through collars and hems and makes you wish you'd stayed home, and I watched the blur of motion and color with the detachment of someone who had nothing urgent left to rush toward. That's when I saw him, Jason. Not in my mind, not in memory, but in real time, walking just past the bike rack in a coat I didn't recognize, his hair a little longer, his posture a little more tired, and though everything in me braced for the moment our eyes would meet, I knew even before it happened that this wasn't a reunion or a return. It was something more mundane, more cruel in its simplicity. He paused in front of the cafe for only a second, just long enough to read the hours still taped to the glass, and I couldn't tell if he recognized the shadow of my face behind the pane or if the reflection of the street kept me hidden from him completely. But when he turned his head, just slightly, my body moved without permission. A step forward, a shift in posture, a breath that caught in my throat like a name I wasn't allowed to say anymore. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to stop walking. I wanted him to want something he no longer had the right to reach for. But when his eyes finally lifted, they didn't land on mine. They slid past me like I was part of the glass, part of the building, part of the place he no longer belonged to. I stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement would shatter the moment into something even smaller than it already was. And when he turned away, when he kept walking into the rain without hesitation, I didn't chase him, didn't knock on the glass, didn't call his name. I simply let him disappear into the crowd of umbrellas and headlights and passing buses, because I knew now that love, or whatever we had tried to make of it, wasn't always about who stayed or who fought. Sometimes it was about who turned away first and why. I pressed my palm to the glass and held it there, not because I was hoping he'd turn around, but because I needed to feel the cold of the window seep into my skin as a reminder that this was real, that the ache in my chest wasn't metaphor but consequence, and that I wasn't the victim of anyone's betrayal but my own. Behind me, the cafe lights hummed softly, the machines clicked into their idle cycles, and the quiet wrapped around my shoulders like a coat I hadn't asked for but now wore without question.